And we're back, and it's COMP305 here at Centennial College, and it's the winter 2016 semester, and it's week 2, lesson 2, I can't believe it already, part 1 of our broadcast, okay? And what we're going to be talking about today is unity, right? Okay. What I'd like you to do, this is bad. See, this is what I'm talking about, right? The guy who came in late is going to get all the answers. What I want you to do is, I want you to, of course it's being recorded too, I want you to, to kind of kick off your Unity for a second and just make a new project like I have here. It's a new empty project, right? I just called my project new project. Doesn't matter, right? It's for demo purposes right now, and we're gonna do this a couple times here, right? So again, you go to Unity, and are you done? Huh? No? What was that? Well, okay, it's fine. If you finished, if you just started already? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So what we're doing is we're looking at Unity here, and remember last time, just as a review, this is the scene view, right? This is the game view. I've got a couple of other windows here that I like to use, and if you notice, I'm using this layout that it looks like a 2x3, right? So there's different layouts here in Unity, and if you notice on the top right corner of this little layout button, the default that you would be seeing if you started off Unity for the first time looks like this, right? I told you again, and I'll kind of say it again, to me this isn't a workable layout, right, in my view, because I have a compressed screen, I'm projecting, right, so my view is going to be slightly different than what you would see. Now you can operate in whatever view you feel comfortable, because this is your layout, right? So if you click on default on the top right corner here, you can certainly go to 2x3. This side did it last time, right? So I went to 2x3. And notice this is like, the game down here, and there's a scene up here. You can move these panels around the way you like, and you can always go back and put them back the way you like too, right? With going back to default. I can also create my own. Notice how I can say save layout, right? So I can make my own layout so you don't have to ever do this again, right? You can always revert back to factory settings if you messed up a layout. Like if you save the layout and it's something else, you can always revert back, and Unity will reset itself back to the way it was. This is for Unity 5. Okay, so if I take my game, I don't want to have these two things in different windows, so how I built my layout last week, and I'll show you again this week, is I grab my game, and notice I can grab this tab and put it next to my scene. All right, so let's try doing that, please. This is a you guys do with me thing. Even in Unity 4, you can still do it with me. All right, it's a very similar thing. Please don't watch me. Do it. Okay, so again, I'm going to operate in my scene. In my scene, remember, what we do here primarily in my scene is we take a look at, and just to show you this for a second, in my scene view, what we're doing is we're looking at the actual objects. So if I want to manipulate my objects, I do it in my scene view, right? If I'm in my game view, that's the live view. That's the live preview of what my game is going to look like, all right? So scene view and game view are pretty important. Now notice that I have my hierarchy, and it's kind of messed up here. I have my hierarchy and I have my project. I definitely want my project inspector here to be underneath my hierarchy, right? So I want to take my project and just do one of these and just drop it underneath here, right? And what it's going to do is it's going to break out underneath my hierarchy. So here's my hierarchy and here's my project, which gives me a lot more space on this side, right? And then I'm going to pull this over to the right side. Okay, so that's kind of the view I want you guys to use to match with me. You don't have to, right? I mean, I want you to be comfortable doing whatever you feel like doing, but this is just your view, right? So please try and have your stuff look like mine if you want to follow the examples. Now online, they might have a different view of how things go, and that's perfectly valid too. Okay, and sometimes what you'll see me doing is expanding the view so that way I can illustrate a particular inspector like this one, right? So now I have a few objects in my view here. I'm going to get rid of my game object because I added that in, right, by itself. So you should just have main camera and your directional light. If I want to find my main camera, if you notice, as I click on them here in the hierarchy, they get highlighted here in the scene, right? So hierarchy, main camera, directional light, and they get highlighted over here. Here's your manipulator. Notice that, again, in contrast to Blender, that in Unity, the manipulator is Y up. Actually, the universe in Unity is Y up, right? Whereas in Blender, it's Z up, right, or Z up, right? So that's the way it looks right now. Again, the manipulator arm, it allows us to move our object around in three-dimensional space. And notice on the right-hand side here, our transform changes as we move the manipulator around. So, and again, I'm just constraining things on different axes. So I'm constraining things here, right? And notice on the Z-axis, the blue axis, which is traditionally Z, I'm constraining this object. I'm moving it around across the Z-axis here, right? And the same thing goes for the X-axis. Here's the X-axis. As I move it across here, I'm constraining this together, right? What if I grab it from the middle? Can I do that? I can. I can grab it from the middle, and there's no constraint. I can move it in all dimensions all at the same time, right? Which is kind of bad, right? Because you have no control over where your objects are in space, right? How about if I want to move them back? I can always undo. So I can kind of control Z, Command Z on the Mac, and just undo, 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 until it goes back to where it originally started, right? Somewhere. And the same thing with my camera. My camera is hovering around 0, 1, and -10, and I can move that around, and you get a little preview like I showed you last week, right? This little preview right here shows you what your camera is looking at. So right now your camera is only looking at one place, late. And that's the only thing that it's looking at. So if I move things around like this, right, my camera's view would look at different objects. Now, there's nothing in the scene, so it can't detect anything. And the other thing it won't do is it won't see the lights. Even if there's a light in the scene, unless it's bright and it's looking directly into the camera lens, it won't be seen. You can't see a light. Like we don't see light here. I can't see the light unless it's shining in my eyes, right? So that, just like it is in real life, you won't be able to see it unless it's shining right in the camera. And even then, you'd have to turn certain things on for that to happen. So there's nothing in the scene right now, and that's why you don't see anything. Let's add an object to the scene. Who remembers how to add a primitive? What's a primitive, by the way, first? Anyone can answer what a primitive is? What's a primitive? You came in late.
Sphere, cube, circle.
Very good. Primitives are the basic things that you can add in. And if you right-click here, right, it allows you to add a 3D object in the hierarchy. And you notice there's a cube, a sphere, a capsule, a cylinder, a plane, quad, all kinds of other stuff you can put in here. These are all considered primitive shapes or default shapes that belong to Unity. On the 2D side, which we're going to start today, it's sprites, right? So flat sprites. That's what the 2D sprite side uses. Lights, you can add lights in there as well. Directional light, point lights, spotlights, area lights, all the different kinds of lights. Audio sources, different UI elements, text elements, different things like that. You can add them all in here by right-clicking in your menu in Unity 5 and selecting the object to add. You can also do it through this little button right here on the top, right? So if you look at here, if you go to create, I have the same menu options right here. That's two, right? That's the second way of doing it. How about other ways? How about if I go here, can I, do anything here? How about assets? Or here's the assets. Look at the assets menu, and I can do the same thing here. I can add a folder. I can add C# scripts. I can add different sprites, different materials, all kinds of stuff right through the assets menu as well. Right? So different ways of adding different things, different objects. Game object, I can create an empty object. I can create an empty child. I can add in different objects into my scene just like I would with my right context menu by right-clicking. Right. Someone's listening to the video at the same time I'm doing this. Okay, so that's how you add it. So let's add a basic object. Let's add a capsule today because normally we add cubes. We'll add a capsule. So I'm going to right-click here. I'm going to add a 3D object that's a capsule, right? There it is. And if you notice, it's called capsule, and this is what it looks like, and this is inside my scene space. But if I click on my camera, it may or may not see my capsule, depending on where it's pointing, right? Right now, I can see my capsule in my scene. And if I go to my game view, this is my scene view, where I do all my manipulation. This is where I actually program a lot of my game elements in here. And this is my game view, which is actually giving me a preview of what the game will look like. Notice how the capsule is in the dead center of the game, right? So, again, the camera has to be able to see the object in your scene, and the scene has to be lit. An example of that is if I turn off the directional light. Notice how the directional light has, up on the top of the inspector, has a name, directional light. And there's also this checkbox for the tag. I can turn the tag off. Once I turn this off, notice how there's no light appearing in the scene anymore, right? No light in the scene, everything is dark. We don't see color without light, even in real life, right? And that's what it does. So that's one thing. It turns off everything. It turns off the whole component, makes it invisible. I can also turn individual components off. Now in this case, there's only one component other than that transform for the light, and that is the light component, right? So if I turn this off, it's very similar. It looks the same, but it's not the same. The light actually does exist in the scene. This component is just turned off, which is just the light component. Every game object in Unity comes from the superclass game object, right? So if I have a light, the superclass for that light object is game object, right? So if I write any kind of code, I got to keep that in mind. It's a game object, right? Okay, so lights, and here's my capsule. And then let's add a plane. So this is the other way we do it. So right click here, and I'm going to add into my scene. Different ways of doing this. Again, a 3D object, a plane. Notice how my plane appears below my capsule. My capsule, if you think about it from a positioning perspective, there's, again, 3 different properties here, or 3 different object properties. So one is position, which has X, Y, and Z. Position is actually an object, right? And then you have rotation, right? 0, 0, 0, so it's completely in the right rotation, and then the scale, which is a 1-to-1, right? I can change the scale, I can change the position, I can rotate here in the inspector, or I can try and do some of that here. What I can't do in Unity is model. I don't do modeling in Unity. I do it in Blender, I do it in Maya, I do it in 3D Studio Max, all right? So don't try and model stuff in Unity, it won't work. Okay, so if you notice, here's the capsule, and if I want to change my scale on the X side, and I want to make this the X scale, there's 2 ways to do it. I could type a value, like put 2, to make it wider, as an example, or if I go back to 1, I could always, if you hover over the X, the actual letter for the value, X or Y or Z, if I hover my mouse over it, it becomes a slider, where I can slide my value out as much as I want, right? So that's kind of a useful quality. If you notice, it can also invert. It can also go negative, not just positive, right? So you can do that for all values. You can do that for position, right? Where you can move things around numerically here. You can do that for rotation, where I can rotate things across the x-axis here, right? As accurately or as as I'd like. I can do it by eye, and I can also do it by number. So if I want 30-degree rotation, I can do a 30-degree rotation, like an actual number that's going to be put in there. And notice if I put 180, what it does is it flips around. If I go 90, again, just it goes flat. Depending on what I want to do, it'll preserve all that stuff for different objects. Notice that the objects right now have a default material, like we talked about this last time. The default material is a blank material. It's like white, right? It really isn't a material. It's just something of a container. And when you actually run the scene by clicking the Run button up on the top, right, you'll notice that everything is white. And depending on the view, this is the view that we're looking at. This is the camera. The camera's looking at it from over here. You just see a white surface, and it may or may not look convincing, depending on how you set things up. Okay, if you want your camera to see what I'm seeing, right, well, you can certainly move your camera around, right? I can move my camera over here, right? I can move my camera back here, and I can swivel my camera's view, right, by rotating it. Now, I can rotate it by clicking the buttons up here. I can rotate the camera by moving it around over here. For example, across the Y, I can rotate my camera so my scene will start coming into view. Notice how I'm rotating it so that my scene is coming into view. I can see my shape. And if I don't like that, if I want to see that the camera looks from a kind of a downward view, I can rotate my camera again across the x-axis, right? So that way I can see my view the way I like. Notice how my camera's box, the outlines of the camera's box come into view to give me an idea of what we're looking at. Okay, so I can see my objects. So my objects have no color, and I want to add color to my objects. Now remember what I said last week, just as a recap. Whenever we enter Unity and we want to create a new project, it's not enough to start modeling like this. I recommend to you start off by creating some default or basic folders. What are the folders that I asked you to create last week? Hint, hint, this will probably be a question on your test next week. Okay, materials. Let me do that. So how do I create my folder? I right click here in my assets on the right hand side. I right click and I go create, new folder, right? And I name it materials. Right, there it is. Notice how I have a folder icon here, right? Let me just bring that up so you guys can see that way in the back, right? Here's my folder icon up here. I don't like folder icons. I want it as a list. So I'm going to take this little slider down here and then slide it to the left. Now it becomes a list. Okay? Cool. So there's my folder icons and it's materials, right? What other folders should I add in? Materials, what else? Scenes is important. And the way when I add scenes in there, I want to use the underscore so that my scenes kind of bubble up to the top of my view, right? So here's my scenes. The other one would be scripts. Same kind of idea, scripts, underscore scripts. And then I want to add in some other things too, like prefabs. We're going to talk about prefabs again today. Prefabs. Here's prefabs. And you might have other things like textures. Let's add some other textures in here, right? So textures and other things. Some other things you want to add into the scene. Right? Now this is a 3D scene, a 2D scene, which we're going to be talking about today as well, and tomorrow, is going to be slightly different because it's not going to have the same folder structure because we may want sprites as something else we want to add into our scene as well, right? So there we go. So scenes, scripts, materials, prefabs, textures, and there could be other things too. We can keep on going. Like for example, we can add sprites, we can add other things in here. Okay, so we have our default scenes. I want to save my scene before I move on, right? And I can do that by going File, Save Scene. And it's going to ask me where I want my scene to be in. And of course, I want to put it in on Mac. You just have to navigate like this and going to the scenes. Windows is very similar. Navigate to your scenes folder and then change your default scene. We're going to call it for now main. So let's call this scene main and press Save. All right, so now we have our scene named, and now I can add some materials. I can double click on my folder to open it up. So if I double click on materials folder, it opens up, and I'm just gonna bring this up so you can see it a bit more. In here, I wanna right click and create a material, just like we did in Blender. So I'm gonna right click here, like we did last week. I'm gonna create a new material. And this material we're gonna name, maybe let's name them colors for now again. So we'll name this one red. This red material. And notice on the right, the material shader, the way the shading language is interpreting this material, it's a standard shader. There's other options here. Standard with specular setup, FX, UI, mobile, nature, particles, skybox, a bunch of different ones that you can choose from a shading perspective. We're going to leave it as the standard shader for now. And we're going to just change the color by clicking in this little box over here, right? Clicking the box and then choosing this, let's make it red, like red, red, right in the corner. You can also, so all I did was pull it. I kind of move my slider around here, whatever my point is, by left clicking and dragging. But you can also decide on a value here, an RGBA value right here. So here's my R value. So if I say, if it's 255, so I want to turn on all the red value on, and I can turn these ones off. I can make this 00, so I can make it really red, as an example. What's this A value here? Who remembers what the A value is? Anybody? Alpha, which means how much transparency you have. So I can also pull these values down here, so I can actually slide it down this way as well. So there's different ways of doing it. I can control it up here. I can slide it down here, right? By changing my alpha value, right? Or I can put it numerically, or I can put it in a hex code. Lots of options to match the color exactly with what you're building, right? Let's leave it at 255, 255, which is 100% alpha and purely red, right? So that's the color. And we've named this thing red. It is a red color. It gives us a bit of a preview of what it's going to look like over here in terms of specularity and everything else. Specularity is your reflectivity. Let's turn the smoothness all the way down to 0 as well to make it very flat looking. So from a smoothness perspective, I turn this down to 0, right? Okay, so that's our material. Remember what a material is. Material is a container that can contain other things like textures, right? And a material gets applied to an object. So I want to apply it to my capsule. So first I got to click on my capsule in the hierarchy. And then a couple ways I can do this. I can drag this material from my assets menu into the scene like this. which is good and bad because you have some loss of control. Or I can take my material, I'm still left clicking and dragging, and move it on top of the add component piece to my material. And if I do that, it changes color. That's more accurate. Right, a couple ways to do that. There's other ways too. I'm just trying to show you the fast ways. Okay, so this is cool. I've got a red capsule, and you know what? Let's make the ground green. So how would I do that? I'm going to make another material. So let's go ahead. You make another material, make it green, and attach it to the ground plane. And I'm going to rename the ground. To rename an object, click on it in the hierarchy, and on the right-hand side, you can certainly just rename it. Just change the name of the object right here. So call it ground. Let's leave the capsule as a capsule for now. We don't need to change the name of that. But I want you to change the default material for the ground plane to something like a green plane. Go ahead. Take a few seconds to do that. It will take a few seconds. And then I'll start after you. Okay, so how do I do that? For those people who don't know or who didn't see the steps, I right-click here in my materials because I want to organize the stuff I add in their proper folders. I don't have to. I can put it on the root if I want to, on the root folder in the assets folder, right? But I want to organize my folders this way just to keep organized because we're going to have lots and lots of assets, right? I'm going to right-click here. I'm going to add a new material, and the new material is going to be called green. You can call it ground. There's other things you can call it as well. And on the right-hand side here, notice that the albedo, which is your diffuse property in Blender, if you look at this as white, I can just change this by dragging. First, I got to just choose this and this line here where the green is. I want this kind of green, and then say I kind of move it over here. And if I want a very specific green, I can always manually do it. So I'm going to put 0, 0 red and 0 blue and all green, and I want to make it all fully opaque, so I don't want any kind of alpha. There's my green, right? And now I want to apply this. Let's do it the other way this time. Let me grab my green and kind of paint it on my scene like this by just dragging and dropping, right? And there we go. And if I look at my game as a preview, this is what it would look like, right? My game view, this is what my camera would see, just like this. Okay, so basics in Unity. We did this kind of last week too. I wanted to recap this week so that way you guys wouldn't be too freaked out by it. Again, my scene view and my game view, those are the two things we care about right now. Scene view, we can manipulate things. Game view is our preview of our game. If I play the game, if I click play, notice it doesn't do anything. It just sits there because there isn't any physics attached to this thing. I can add other components like we did last week to make the physics go. For example, I can add physics to this capsule so it rolls. How do I do that? Well, if I go back to my scene, I click on my capsule, or I click on it over here. And let's collapse some of these components. I don't want to remove them, just collapse them. I can collapse them by clicking the down arrow here, right? Collapse, 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 collapse. So I only see my mesh up here, right? And if I want to, I can expand or collapse. This is already collapsed. Let's go and add a component. I'm going to add in a physics component. And in my physics component, I want to add in a rigid body, right? A rigid body. When I add a rigid body, it tells me there's a mass. There's some properties here: a mass, some drag, angular drag. I can use gravity. I can also choose is kinematic. We don't want to do that right now. And then also what kind of collision detection it does and the whole thing. Let's leave it as my rigid body with a mass of 1. And I want to lift my capsule up a little higher. So let's lift it up kind of outside the scene like this. Notice how in the game we don't see it right now. We just see a bit of shadow now that I've lifted it up high, right? By using the manipulator arm, right? These manipulators here to drag it up along the y-axis, right? And now if I press play, it's going to take me to my scene view and it's going to drop my object like really flat. And it won't roll or anything, right? How do I make this thing roll? Any ideas? Well, there's a couple things I can do. One is I can angle my plane, right? So if I want to make my, this capsule roll towards me, first of all, let's rotate it. So I'm going to kind of click the rotation. And what are the hotkeys for these buttons up here? Anyone remember? Q, W, E, R, T, right? It's just along the top part of your keyboard, Q, W, E, R, T. So if I choose the E button, right, or click this button right here, I can rotate it. I can certainly rotate this so it looks like this, right? So it kind of looks at the scene, right? So now when I play, it's kind of looking like the capsule is looking like this, right? That's pretty easy. And now what I want to do is, when it rolls, I want this whole plane to be rotated. So the way to do is, of course, I'm going to angle this by clicking the plane, right? As an example, here's my plane. And I want to rotate it, the plane, and I can do this in two ways. I can rotate it across the, now it's kind of a weird axis, yeah? Right? Because I don't want it just to be rotated across the x-axis. I also want it to be rotated across the z-axis, the z-axis. So I want both rotations to happen, just like this one. If I want to match it up with this one to show you what it is, how it's rotated, if I click here, you can see that the rotation for this thing is 90 degrees and around 311 degrees rotating on the y-axis towards us, right? We don't want it on the y-axis for our plane. We want our y-axis to remain 0, right? But our z-axis and our x-axis should rotate a little bit. And if I change it to test it, if I go 10, you can notice that it'll rotate this way. And if I want it 10 along the z-axis, it'll be that way. So I don't want it that way. I want it towards us. So I want it negative 10. And by the way, how do I know negative or positive, right? In the scene, if you go into the scene, that's positive. If I go outside of the scene, towards me, it's negative, right? Okay. So notice how this is, right? So now this plane is angled like this. It's going to obviously fall. Let's see how it looks now if I press play. And if I press play, it doesn't sit there. It rolls down the scene because I've got, it's the plane is angled, so it's going to fall, right? If I want to pull the camera back a little bit because the camera's too close, so if I want to kind of take the camera, undo. If I want to take the camera and then change this to the manipulator arm and pull it back, I can certainly try and pull it back by hand, but it's probably the best thing to just pull it back by restricting it where it's going to look. And you can actually look at the preview to kind of get an idea of what you want to see. So I want to see the whole plane almost like in a diamond shape. Then I'm going to use the camera to pull it around so I can see the plane that I'm looking at. So press play, and now you can see that it's going to roll towards me nicely and off the screen. It's going to fall into oblivion. And it's going to keep falling forever. If I was to actually click on the capsule, you can see that the transform is continuously changing, right? What about if I want to make this, can I change these values in runtime? Yes, I can change the values in runtime. That's the really cool thing. So if I want to, like for example, right now the position of my Y is like -2 something, right? If I want to reposition this really quickly, I can go to the gear icon here, and I can go reset. And if I reset it, boom, it kind of falls into oblivion, right? And you can see that it reset where it was before. I can do that right away by clicking the reset button. Or I can assign this another option. I can move it around too. I can go into my scene view, and I can physically, I'm still playing, right? Oh, there it is. It's going to fall to oblivion, right? See how it fell through the scene? It's still running. My game is still running. My preview is still running. So if I go back to my capsule, I can reset it again. Let's try this again. Reset. Oh, there it is. And it's going to fall, right? And I can go into my scene view if I want to, and as long as my capsule is there, and I can rotate it around my my y-axis, right? I can rotate around my y-axis. Here's my position. Here's my rotation, right? So I can change the rotation so that it'll actually control what's going to happen to it in real time. This is a really handy feature when you're testing your game, right? If I want to test components of my game, I can run them in real time to give me what the scene is going to look like. And a couple things to note here, right? That when I test stuff out, if I change a value in real time while it's playing, right? I can change my value. Like for example, right now I'm not playing. If I play and I want to change my value, right? So let's say I go back and reset my my cylinder. There it is. Here's my capsule. I can keep resetting. Watch. I can keep resetting. I keep doing that. Right there it is. And I can change my value. So example right now my mass is 1. Let's change my mass to 0, and it won't accept that. It will be like a 0001. Here it is. Notice if I do that and if I go reset now, it'll just stay there. It won't move too much because my mass is so low, right? And I can also use my gravity. I can put my gravity as 0 too, right? So it won't be affected by gravity. I can change these values here. Now remember, I'm in runtime. I'm in runtime. In runtime, anything I change, right, will remain as is, right? I can also put some constraints in here. So if I look at constraints, right, I can freeze my position. I can freeze my X and Y and Z position so they don't move, they don't fall anymore. And I can also freeze my rotation. I can freeze it all. And if I go back to reset, it's going to appear exactly where it's supposed to be, right? This is all in runtime, right? And when I go back to my scene view now, I can certainly manipulate this thing by pulling it up the way I like, right? And if I go back to my game, it's going to show me this scene the way I like. And then I can remove the restrictions. I can remove the X rotation. I can add my gravity. So I can go back to using a gravity. I can increase my mass to 1, right? Okay, I can unfreeze the Y location so it can fall, and the Z location so it can also fall down if I want to. I can change my rotation so that it starts to fall, and I can test all that so I can simulate what it's going to look like to fall in my scene. So I've done all these changes, but when I stop recording or stop playing, everything's back to normal. In runtime, I can make whatever change I want, right? In design time, when I design my stuff, it doesn't matter. It won't affect what I'm doing. And this is good and bad, because sometimes what we do is we manipulate something in runtime because it looks good, and then when we go back, we're like, oh, damn. What were those changes? Right? Because it's gone. So sometimes people, what they do is when they press, you can configure Unity, so when you press play, it changes color. So the whole background changes color from, let's say, the natural color of what Unity looks like to blue or green or something. So you know you're in runtime. Otherwise, you'll change stuff and then it won't work. Okay, one more thing before we break. When we come back, I'm going to be covering a couple things. One is my little PowerPoint presentation that I have up for you, not that one. And if you look up on eCentennial, I've got a couple of documents. I'm also going to be talking about my assignment details, which I will be posting in a second. But if you look at this week 2 PowerPoint, this is what we're going to be looking at. And I really want to talk about the execution order of event functions, because it's important to understand this. And the reason why is because when we start scripting, which is going to happen right away, you have to understand what each of these event functions do. Okay? So let's take a short break, 5-minute break, because we're a little bit running behind, right? And when we come back, I'll get right into scripting, Unity scripting, and we'll talk about some of these functions and what they do, the order of operations inside our scripts. Okay, go ahead. Let's take 5 minutes.